Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kara Hendrickson, the Executive Director of BPI. On behalf of the Free to Move Coalition and BPI, I would like to welcome you to the second of a two-part webinar series on traffic stops. BPI is an independent law and policy center where we work to address compelling racial and social justice issues that impact Chicago and the state of Illinois. Through our advocacy, we work to drive racial, social, and economic justice through a focus on police accountability, reform of the criminal legal system, and housing and community development. BPI has worked for years to enact systemic police reforms, including by strengthening the police accountability system, promoting community safety, improving police practices, and reimagining the roles that police departments and other entities play in producing public safety. As part of our Reimagining Public Safety work, we are a proud member of the newly formed Free to Move Coalition, which is working together to envision a more equitable traffic safety system in Chicago. The Free to Move Coalition coordinator, Jose Manuel Almanza, will describe the coalition in a moment. On March 7th, BPI and the Free to Move Coalition hosted the first part of this webinar series titled The Problem with Traffic Stops in Chicago. There, BPI counsel Amy Thompson presented on data illustrating the excessive, racially disparate, and ineffective use of traffic stops in Chicago. The data showed that, first, traffic stop numbers in Chicago have skyrocketed in recent years, increasing almost 700% after 2015. These stops have increasingly focused on low-level traffic code violations, like a broken headlight or improper registration, offenses that generally don't present significant traffic dangers. Second, the Chicago Police Department is using minor traffic stops as a pretext to stop drivers and fish for criminal activity. But the data shows this strategy doesn't work. Less than 5% of stops in 2021 resulted in a citation, and less than 1% resulted in recovery of contraband, like firearms, drugs, or alcohol. Finally, Black and Latina drivers on Chicago's south and west sides are experiencing the brunt of this policing strategy. Compared to white drivers, Black and Latina drivers are disproportionately stopped, searched, and subjected to use of force and arrested. For example, Black drivers are 6 times more likely to be stopped than white drivers. To read the report elaborating on the Chicago traffic stops data described in that webinar, visit freetomoveshy.org, linked in the chat. During the panel discussion that followed that data presentation, we invited experts from across Chicago to come together and discuss these multifaceted problems. The conversation confirmed that the Chicago Police Department is performing minor traffic stops, often with the intent of finding a weapon or some other contraband on the driver. But oftentimes, the relatively few guns that are found during traffic stops are the result of technical registration offenses, not a violent offense. We also heard about how Black and Latina drivers are being subject to frequent traffic stops and how they are negatively affected. Not only can being repeatedly pulled over instill fear and embarrassment in a driver, but it can make communities less trustful of police. To view a recording of that panel discussion and the data presentation, you can also visit freetomoveshy.org, linked in the chat. The data, the panel conversation, and the continual calls for change from targeted communities in Chicago should cause our city to reconsider the use of this ineffective and controversial tactic. To set us up for that conversation, I'll turn next to Walter Katz, Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures. Before I turn it to Walter, I'll make 2 housekeeping announcements. First, this presentation today is being recorded so that we can share it with future audiences. And second, there'll be an opportunity at the end of the panel conversation today to hear from questions from the audience. So at any point, please enter your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar screen. Now I'll turn it over to Walter.
Thank you, Kara, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased to be here today to introduce this second webinar on traffic stops in Chicago. Today's second installment of this traffic stops webinar series will jumpstart that reconsideration by learning from jurisdictions who have been where Chicago is and have taken important steps towards change. Learning from these policymakers and experts can bring people together to consider solutions to the problems laid out in the first webinar. Arnold Ventures is a philanthropic organization which invests in sustainable change, building it from the ground up based on research, deep thinking, and a strong foundation of evidence. I lead our work in community safety and policing, and we began thinking about the impacts from the overuse of police traffic stops about 1.5 years ago. Last year, we started supporting the work of groups around the country to learn more, including BPI. We applaud everyone at BPI for their tireless effort that resulted in the report that was published earlier this month. And that is why we are proud to partner in today's event, which will feature a discussion among our moderator and panelists who each have taken unique approaches to rethinking the way their jurisdiction approaches traffic safety. We'll hear from leaders from across the country, from San Francisco, Virginia, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, about what they learned in their communities about traffic stops and the opportunities for change. Arnold Ventures is looking at these innovations as opportunities for our evaluation of the effects of these new policies in racial equity, legitimacy, and traffic and public safety. If you want to talk more about research ideas, please reach out to us. And now, to introduce the panel, I'll turn it over to Jose Manuel Almanza from Equiticity and the Free to Move Coalition.
Thank you so much for that intro. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Manuel Almanza, and I'm the Director of Advocacy and Movement Building for Equiticity. Equiticity is a racial equity movement. We move through time and space, programming and advocating for racial equity, increased mobility, and racial justice to make lives better for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people of color across the country. I'm also the coordinator of the Free to Move Coalition. The Free to Move Coalition is pleased to be co-hosting this webinar series. We are an alliance of community and advocacy organizations working to create a safer, more racially equitable system of traffic safety in Chicago that works for everyone, especially those who have been most impacted by discriminatory police enforcement. Let me introduce you to our moderator and panelists. You can find their full bios linked in the chat. Our moderator is Lauren Jones. Lauren Jones serves as staff counsel with a focus on police accountability at BPI Chicago. She graduated from the University of Illinois College of Law in 2018 and began her career in civil rights litigation, representing victims of police misconduct. Currently, her work focuses on community oversight of policing and reimagining effective strategies for creating authentic public safety for all communities. She also provides legal, policy, and technical advice to amplify advocacy efforts by organizations and coalitions. Our first panelist is Max Carter-Oberstone. Max is the Vice President of the San Francisco Police Commission, where he spearheaded the effort to enact a new regulation to curtail the use of pretext stops. Before joining the commission, Max was an Orrick Justice Fellow at the Policing Project at NYU Law School, a nonprofit think tank focused on police reform and democratic accountability. Max is now an appellate litigator at a large global law firm representing clients before the US Supreme Court and other appellate courts. Our next panelist is Bradley R. Haywood. Bradley is the Chief Public Defender for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church, Virginia, and founder of Justice Forward Virginia, a criminal justice reform advocacy organization that led efforts to pass historical limits on pretextual policing practices during the 2020 special session of the Virginia General Assembly. Bradley is also the author of Ending Race-Based Pretextual Stops, Strategies for Eliminating America's Most Egregious Police Practice, published in January 2023 in the Richmond Public Interest Law Review. The next panelist is Councilmember Isaiah Thomas, a third-generation Philadelphian. Councilmember Thomas grew up in Northwest Philadelphia. During his time on council, Thomas has championed initiatives that have provided millions of dollars for youth programming and introduced historic legislation to better the lives of all Philadelphia, including driving equality. Thomas is a proud graduate of Philadelphia Public Schools. He lives in the Oak Lane neighborhood of Philadelphia with his wife and children. Last but not least, our final panelist is Katie Wright. Katie is the mother of Dante Wright, who was killed on April 11th, 2021 during a traffic stop in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. She is on the Dante Wright and Colby Dimmick Heisler Community Safety and Violence Prevention Implementation Committee in Brooklyn Center, a committee created by city ordinance made up of primarily of directly impacted community members who together will make public safety policy recommendations. Katie chairs the committee's traffic stops policy work group. I'll now hand it over to Lauren to start the panel.
Thank you, Jose, and good afternoon, everyone. So all of our panelists come from jurisdictions that have tackled alternatives to traffic safety in different ways. So I would love to begin with some questions that introduce all of you to their work and their approaches to this advocacy. I'd like to start with Councilmember Thomas. In 2021, Philadelphia passed the Driving Equality Act, which limited the police's ability to make stops for minor traffic violations. Could you tell us a little bit about the problem with traffic stops in Philadelphia that led up to the creation of this piece of legislation?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me again. This is an amazing conversation and a great organization that's decided to convene us all here today. For us in Philadelphia, we've looked at a number of issues, whether it was the Bailey consent agreement or other issues related to motor vehicle code violations. And we also looked at the data. I know we have a public defender on the panel here today, but we work with the public defender's office to analyze the data in the city of Philadelphia. And between the court ruling and the data, we've seen that disproportionately, we were stopping people of color while simultaneously not putting a dent in crime at all. A lot of folks who were born and raised in the city of Philadelphia will speak to being pulled over by police as a rite of passage, as something that was pretty much a norm as you transition from childhood to adulthood. So at the end of the day, with the data, similar to the data I heard around Chicago, you guys said that 1% of stops that led to an actual search found contraband and or a weapon. Our numbers were even lower than that as it relates to how often a weapon and or contraband was found when it came to a motor vehicle code stop. So we decided to put ourselves in a position to try to address the issue of pre-contextual stops and address the issue of inefficient policing and try to improve the relationship between communities of color and law enforcement by passing the driving equality legislation, which was implemented into law just a little over a year ago. And here we are today as it relates to the legislation. And we, the data is out for us, and I'm looking forward to discussing that data throughout the course of our panel here today.
Thank you, Councilmember Thomas. As just a follow-up to that, could you talk a little bit about how the legislation addressed the issue with traffic stops and what the legislation looks like for those who don't know?
Sure, absolutely. And I think an important part of recognizing what we did in Philadelphia is that it was a collaborative effort. So based on the problem that I just presented, we put together a coalition between my office, the mayor's office, the public defender, and the police department. And that comes under our managing director's office in the city of Philadelphia. And we had a working group where we came up with motor vehicle code violations that we felt like were used to discriminate against certain people, but also would not have a negative impact on public safety. So after working together for a year, our coalition came up with 8 motor vehicle code stops that we felt like would not have a negative impact on public safety. And those motor vehicle code stops are emission and inspection stickers, minor damage to the bumper, one taillight being out, a 60-day grace period on renewal of registration, something dangling from your mirror, and the relocation of your license plate as long as it would be displayed clearly. So at the end of the day, those motor vehicle code violations are things that, again, do not have a negative impact on public safety. We're not talking about things like speeding or running a stop sign or turning left where you're not supposed to turn left. And this was something that, again, took us over a year to come up with as it relates to the working group that we put together. And then after it was passed into law in the fall of 2021, we also gave the police department about 90 days to be able to train officers in a way that they felt like would equip them to be able to implement the new legislation. So the bill was enforced into law in the spring of 2022, and here we are a year later, and we've already seen like significantly less stops. We approximate at least 10,000 Black and brown folks would have been pulled over last year had this bill not been in place. So at the end of the day, we're proud of the work that we've done so far, but we recognize that we still have work to do, which is why we have a driving equality oversight team that monitors the data and meets on a monthly basis to ensure that we're trending and moving in the right direction. So thank you for that second question.
Yes, thank you. And we want to get a little bit more into the effects and the feedback on that a little bit later, but thank you for that explanation. I want to turn to you now, Katie. So your activism on policing and public safety began after the tragic and senseless killing of your son, Dante Wright, during a traffic stop. His death led Brooklyn Center in Minnesota to take steps towards reimagining public safety, and the commission that you're on, the Community Safety and Violence Prevention Implementation Committee, has played an integral role in this effort. Could you tell us a little bit about the creation of this committee, its mission, and the folks involved?
Yes, thank you. The committee and the creation of it actually started long before my son Dante was killed by police. There was a young autistic man named Kobe Demick Heisler who was actually killed August 31st of 2019. At that time, community members were talking and gathering in regards to what community, public safety looked like. And they were, getting this created. But then in April 11th of 2021, my son was pulled over by a police officer for expired tabs and a air freshener hanging from the windshield, which ended up resulting in his death. The police officer unfortunately grabbed a gun instead of a taser and shot my son one time, which caused his death. At that time, communities stepped up, spoke out. They demanded change in Brooklyn Center because now it's just too many people of color being killed by police. And the mayor actually was really, pushing for change and what community safety looks like and what policing looks like in Brooklyn Center. And they created the implementation committee, which then was going to focus on expanded response. So that way, when police officers are going to calls, they not all police officers are able to handle what you would call a crisis response, or and then traffic stops as well. Why are we using armed police officers for low-level traffic offenses? So Mayor Mike Elliott, took action, formed the Dante Wright and Kobe Demick Heisler Community Safety and Violence Prevention Resolution. There were several community members, like I said, that wanted to be a part of this. We all applied for the position to be a part of the resolution and the implementation committee. And right now there are 9 people men and women who sit on this resolution and the implementation committee. We do have 2 subcommittees, one being the traffic stop policy, which I chair that one. And then we have the expanded response committee, which Amity, which is the mother of Kobe Heisler, she sits on and she chairs that position as well. So that's kind of how it formed, and we're just working really hard in Brooklyn Center to make changes. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And before I move on to the next question, I always love talking to you, and I'm inspired by your ability to do this work, being so close to the issue, being so personally affected. So I thank you again, and I think everyone thanks you for your time and your advocacy on this. I wanted you to go a little bit into some of the recommendations that this commission has made and with respect to traffic stops. I know that you all released those some time ago. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, of course. The recommendations that we have actually already proposed to City Council are, related to the low-level traffic stops to end those. So people can't be pulled over for things like air fresheners hanging in the rearview mirror, expired tabs, broken tail lights, and tinted windows is another big one that we're really focusing on, which are all considered non-moving traffic violations, low-level traffic offenses that are not really protecting our community. And that's what police officers are supposed to be doing, is protecting the safety of our community. None of these offenses, by pulling them over, would be doing so. And then consent searches are also another thing that we're really focused on in Brooklyn Center, and we recommended that consent searches are no longer able to be done in the city, and then also no-knock warrants. So those are our recommendations that we had presented to City Council, and are still just kind of in the good fight. So.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, we'll get into the status of that a little bit later on. I wanted to turn to Bradley. Virginia was the first state to successfully take a statewide approach to addressing stops for low-level violations, traffic stops. Could you tell us a little bit about the problems with traffic stops that your organization saw that kind of prompted this work?
Sure. So I founded Justice Forward Virginia, which is a statewide criminal justice reform advocacy organization. And for most of our existence, we've been led and run by public defenders. And over the years, obviously, we've tuned in more to criminal justice reform and made efforts to change it at the legislative level. But after George Floyd was murdered, I think we started to see a familiar dynamic play out, which is the carceral actors in our systems, like former police chiefs or current police chiefs, or pro-jail Democrats or whoever, were rushing forward to seize control of the narrative, and they often would frame it as police reform, and it was all revolved around concepts like procedural justice. So essentially, how to make police more respectful, how to make interactions between police and citizens less likely to devolve into violence or something like that. And I've always thought that was just, you're not going to get anywhere with that, because we've been doing that for 40 years and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. And the only way that you get somewhere with so-called police reform is through actual criminal legal reform. And it's by addressing the power that police have, because abuse of power comes from power itself. So we thought about, when we were looking at the upcoming special session, Virginia usually has one legislative session. It's very short every year. They call the special session to do criminal justice reform or police reform legislation. So actually, we had drafted a bunch of our priorities already before George Floyd was murdered, but just so happened that one of them was to address pretextual policing. And just became more and more relevant. And I think that the theory there was that if you reduce unnecessary interactions between police and citizens, you are necessarily also going to reduce the incidence of abuse of or excessive force and deaths at the hands of police. And when we started looking at that, we started thinking to ourselves about our own experience. And personally, having been a criminal defense attorney for 20 years now, some of these pretexts, and they're very similar to the ones that were taken off the books in Philadelphia. But, things like loud exhaust and the dangling objects. In Virginia, you could be pulled over just for having air freshener dangling from your rearview mirror. And the pellet decisions were so absurd. They were going so far as to say that, oh, yes, actually, when this statute was written, we were definitely worried about air freshener, because you could run over a kid in a car if you have air freshener. You're just like, it just all just seems so designed to sort of aggrandize police. And so we thought about what were the most frequently abused pretexts that we saw, and that usually almost all of these were disproportionately, if not exclusively, enforced against people of color. Or in some cases, we also extended our pretextual legislation to some non-traffic offenses like jaywalking. And also, we got rid of the odor of marijuana as a pretext, but it was almost exclusively people of color and homeless people often. So we just went through the laundry list of the ones we hated the most, the ones that we thought were abused most frequently. And then we proposed legislation to eliminate them as primary reasons to stop someone. They're still, most of those infractions are still infractions, they're still in the code, but they can only be enforced if the person is pulled over for something else or stopped for something else. So.
Okay, thank you, Brad. And again, we'll get more into some of that process later on. Really interesting. I want to turn to Max really quickly. So different from the other panelists, your work has taken place as part of the San Francisco's Police Commission. And earlier this year, it resulted in the passage of a police policy that addresses a few aspects of traffic stops. What problems did you and the San Francisco community see in traffic stops that led to this work?
Well, thank you, Lauren, for the question. Thank you, BPI and the coalition for the invitation to participate. I just wanted to reiterate one thing Lauren said, which is just how inspirational, Katie, your work is. And, you know, just hearing you retell the story of your son's tragic death is a harrowing reminder of why we're all doing the work that we're doing. So thank you. In terms of what we saw in San Francisco, we saw a lot of the same things that other panelists have noted that they saw in their jurisdiction. So we found that the data showed that there is a cluster of low-level traffic stops that are just not a good use of our limited law enforcement resources. The data revealed that these stops were not producing any real public safety benefit. We weren't making arrests. We weren't finding contraband at any appreciable rate. And these stops also weren't posing any real threat to our roadways. They weren't resulting in crashes or injuries and deaths. And at the same time, these stops were being conducted in a racially disparate way. So in 2019 in San Francisco, Black people were over 10 times more likely to be stopped for an equipment violation. And these racial disparities could not be explained by race-neutral factors such as deployment to certain high crime neighborhoods and other race neutral explanations that are often given. So the third thing that we saw is that in the course of adjudicating disciplinary proceedings, which is something that the commission does for the more serious disciplinary infractions, we just found that a disproportionate percentage of use of force cases and Fourth Amendment violations started from an unnecessary low-level traffic stop. So that was kind of the body of evidence that moved the commission to reform the way we do traffic enforcement.
Thanks, Max. And could you talk a little bit about the details within that policy?
Sure. So the policy is a two-pronged approach. The first prong is similar to what we've heard Philadelphia and Virginia do, which is to isolate, in our case, 9 categories of low-level offenses that meet all the criteria discussed in terms of not having any negative public safety or any public safety benefit, while at the same time being conducted in a racially disparate way. And so it isolates these 9 categories of stops and says that officers can no longer be the sole reason for conducting a traffic stop. It leaves open other avenues to enforce those violations, but they just can't be the only reason for a stop. The second part of the regulation governs what officers can do once a stop is made. And this part of the regulation pertains to all traffic infractions in the vehicle code. And it says that officers can no longer ask for consent to search unless they have reasonable suspicion of some other non-traffic related crime. And same goes for investigatory questions. No more investigatory questions unless there's reasonable suspicion. And the thought here is to just disincentivize the whole reason for making a pretext stop in the first instance, which is hoping to be able to search the vehicle or gin up probable cause to search the vehicle through investigatory questions. So really, we're just requiring that officers have some shred of actual evidence that criminal activity is afoot before asking for consent to search or asking an investigatory question. So those are the two main ways that the policy tries to get at the problem.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned the policy approaches this solution in a couple different ways. I'm curious to know, and just to move on to the process of all of this, what that process of getting to those policy solutions looked like and how the policy was informed by the data in California, San Francisco, but also informed by the community and their feedback and voice.
Sure. So I talked a little bit about how the data played in. We worked very closely with our local transportation or traffic agency rather to make sure that nothing on the list of stops, of restricted stops, posed any threat to the roadways. And then we analyzed our own stop data to ensure, we wouldn't be having any negative public safety outcomes by deprioritizing certain stops. So making sure that they weren't turning into arrests and discovery of contraband and so on. So we had a lot of good data to work with, and we marshaled it and put it to use. In terms of the process, I and other commissioners felt that we wanted to make this the most publicly transparent policy reform process that the commission had ever undertaken. And so we had a number of different ways that we solicited public input. So the first is that at the very outset, we actually published a draft of the policy, which seems like it may not be a big deal, but it's actually pretty radical in terms of how our commission typically operates, where the public doesn't see anything until the very end when the commission is voting on it. But we published something at the very outset. It was an imperfect draft, but we wanted the public to be able to have a concrete sense of what the commission was considering. And we opened it up for public comment, and we received hundreds, if not thousands, of emails and letters, and we published all of those to our website in real time. The second thing that we did is we convened a working group of about 15 to 20 people. These were subject matter experts from kind of diverse backgrounds. We had a number of people from the police department. We had people from community organizations. We had people from various legal organizations, like, for example, the ACLU and the Bar Association. And this group of people met over a course of 4 meetings and went over the policy kind of line by line and really got into the weeds and the nuts and bolts of the policy. The third way we solicited public feedback is we convened community listening sessions. And actually, we enlisted the help of another city department, the Human Rights Commission, to host listening kind of town hall events, during the week after folks get off of work. They all started around 5:30 in various neighborhoods all across the city. And they facilitated conversations and got people's feedback to what we were contemplating, and then organized that feedback, put it together into a report. And then for folks who weren't able to, physically attend the town halls or attend by Zoom, the Human Rights Commission also put together a survey, an online survey that people could respond to provide their feedback. And the results of that survey were also kind of collated and analyzed by the Human Rights Commission. And then the last thing we did is we had closed door town hall listening sessions specifically for officers. And we did not invite department leadership. It was closed to the public, and we wanted officers to feel kind of liberated to, give us their unvarnished views on the policy. And, nobody on the commission has any experience enforcing our traffic laws. And so it's critical that we got feedback from the folks who would actually be charged with implementing this policy, because we wanted it to be something that would work in real life and not just be a high-level statement of ideals and principles. And so we got a lot of great feedback directly from officers about how to make the policy actually operational.
Thank you. And I think I could talk about this specific process for the rest of the time, but I want to make sure that we get to everybody. It's super interesting. Bradley, I wanted to ask you specifically too, as the sole representative from a statewide policy solution. Can you talk about the considerations between implementing local policy versus statewide and some of the, I guess, process that went along with that?
Yeah, and I don't really know how applicable Virginia's experience is to anywhere else. I mean, state legislatures all operate very differently. Virginia happens to have one of the most dysfunctional state legislative processes and most opaque, and it's also just pretty impossible for folks like me, like advocates who are doing it in their free time, to be involved. They just make it incredibly difficult to be involved in the process. But we've found a way. I mean, we had earlier that year, we had had some success in the legislature. The legislature knew who our organization was, and they trusted us as subject matter experts. But really, we took advantage of a very brief window of opportunity, the time when people in America actually cared about making progress in our criminal legal system. And because our legislature was so focused on other issues, oddly, this very transformative legislation kind of flew under the radar and just didn't have a whole lot of pushback at the time. But to answer the question, I think more on a conceptual level, I personally think it's really important to implement these reforms at the broadest level possible. I mean, Chicago is a huge city. It's a third the size of the whole state of Virginia. So maybe it's different in Chicago, but other states that are thinking about doing this, it's just too easy to change things at the local level. I mean, that's good in a way, but like what you're doing is convincing a police chief like they did in Lansing or in Fayetteville, North Carolina to change, or Los Angeles, to change their own internal policies. Well, the next chief, just like happened in Fayetteville, can change right back. So there's no permanence to that. And also, I think like in a state like ours, you can't even restrict police powers at the local level. You have to do it at the statewide level. But most importantly, this problem is not a local or state. It's not even a state problem. It's not a local problem, not a state problem. It's a national problem. And this is the thing when you spend more time with on this issue, racial profiling started in the 70s as a product of the war on drugs. And then it received the imprimatur of the Supreme Court in Wren versus United States in 1996. And ever since then, I mean, it was hard to get police data on traffic stops in the 90s, but you've seen just a consistent rise in the reliance on traffic enforcement as criminal investigations, evidence-free criminal investigations, hunch policing, and it's just become the way that police do their work. And so I think we need to think as broadly as possible. Honestly, Wren should be overturned, and there should be constitutional limitations placed in every state on pretextual policing that only currently exist in one state in the whole country.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. And that segues us to sort of the next section, which is the challenges that we're trying to overcome here with implementing new policy around traffic stops. So there are organizers and advocates on this call around the country who are trying to make the changes that you all have made to help inform their work. We just want to know a little bit more about the lessons learned. Can we start with you, Councilmember Thomas? You talked a little bit about the year-long process it took to get to the policy. Now that it's implemented, what have been some of the challenges, and what were some of the challenges with that process? The
challenges that we face right now is essentially around a lawsuit from the Fraternal Order of Police since the bill has been implemented. I want to be clear. I listened to what Brad said about Virginia. We in Philadelphia do not have the ability to change state law. The motor vehicle code is the motor vehicle code, and that is determined by the state. What we do have the ability to do is to decide how we enforce the law. As a city of the first class, Philadelphia is also a unique city because we're our own county as well too. Whereas though other big cities, they are superseded by a county. In Philadelphia, we're the city and the county in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So at the end of the day, we didn't change the motor vehicle code. We said that we would enforce laws in a certain way. And for us in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, specifically in Philadelphia, when we think about a seatbelt is a violation that was considered a secondary means of enforcement. Whereas though if you were pulled over for speeding, running a red light or something that's a moving violation, and you also didn't have your seatbelt on, then you would get the ticket for the seatbelt on top of whatever other moving motor vehicle code violation got you pulled over. The 8 things that I talked about earlier as it relates to driving equality in Philadelphia, they're in the same category as a seatbelt now. So if your registration is expired, or if you do have a car freshener dangling from your mirror, or you do have minor damage to the bumper, and you're also pulled over for speeding or running a stop sign, those violations can be enforced as well too. For us, it's important to recognize that because our legislation in Philadelphia is mirrored by an executive order. And the reason we feel comfortable with a court challenge is because we've already set precedent as it relates to executive orders based on what we did around marijuana and decriminalizing marijuana, as well as what we did with chokeholds and saying that we would not use a chokehold as it relates to restraining somebody. So at the end of the day, I think the first lesson for us was the importance of collaborating. Because if we decided to do this just as the legislative branch of government and we didn't work with the police department, then people would say that we're doing things that makes the city unsafe. You listen to your data right there around Chicago, you guys said that your traffic stops increased a couple 100% starting in 2015. And clearly that didn't deter crime there. We used the stop and frisk method in the city of Philadelphia decades ago, and that didn't deter crime for us here either as well. So unfortunately, that's not enough for people. And a big lesson for us was the importance of working together. And when you could tell people that you work with the police department to craft this legislation from a public safety perspective, it makes folks feel much better and a lot more comfortable. So that was an important lesson for us, along with working with the mayor and his team, because we wanted it to be married with an executive order to assure that the legislation could withstand a legal challenge. I think sometimes when these incidents take place, and clearly we have Ms. Wright on the call, and of course my condolences go to her and her family and everything that she's going through, and I appreciate her advocacy, and I'm sure she can attest to this more than I can. Sometimes when these incidents take place, we have a knee-jerk reaction and we want to do something right away. And while our passion and our heart might be in the right place from a legal perspective, sometimes what happens is we introduce legislation that cannot withstand a court challenge. And so when months go past and maybe the incident doesn't have the same flair or media attention that it had when an incident first took place, that's when the real fights take place between legislators and the courts and the FOP and folks like that. And far too often across the country, we've seen legislators lose these fights. So for us, outside of building a coalition, working with the mayor and the police department, it was important that we were patient as well too. Similar to what Ms. Wright said, we didn't start this work because of a catastrophe like George Floyd. For us in Philadelphia, it was Walter Wallace, who was killed by police responding to a mental health breakdown in 2020. So at the end of the day, the patience is really important, because when you're crafting legislation that not only can put you in a position where you may have to go to court to defend it, but also when you're trying to change a system that has traditionally oppressed a certain group of people, it takes time to see the proper legislation written the right way and see the impact of that legislation as well too. It's 2023. We started this work 3 years ago. And for the first time, we're actually able to see data as it relates to driving equality. And what the data told us was not only do we see much fewer traffic stops, down 54% as it relates to the traffic stops that's involved in the driving equality legislation. What the data also told us that, and again, Philadelphia is a city with a lot of crime, not only homicides, but we have a lot of hit and run incidents. What the data also told us was that only 2% of traffic stops in the city of Philadelphia deal with things like careless driving and speeding. So at the end of the day, when we talk about keeping communities safe, pulling people over for motor vehicle code violations that are not a public safety hazard clearly has not kept any major city safe all across the country. And so our data, again, not only told us narratives and incidents that essentially didn't take place because the legislation was introduced, we also got to do a deep dive into motor vehicle code stops that we know are a public safety hazard. I don't think anybody on this call would say don't pull somebody over for speeding or running a stop sign or driving recklessly. All of us want our communities to be safe, but at the end of the day, we also recognize that there are tools and tactics that have traditionally been used in the past, and some folks are even talking about using today in 2023 when a lot of our corporates in Philadelphia, and I'm sure Chicago has similar issues, are getting younger and younger. You know, these folks are not even old enough to even drive a car, but yet we still think that randomly pulling people over, which is the equivalence of trying to hit the lottery, is going to keep us safe. These young people are very, very charismatic. They're intelligent. They know how to use technology, and they're 2-3 steps ahead of us. And at the end of the day, our archaic thinking is not only making us more efficient as it relates to government, is putting us in a position where we're continuing to build a wedge between communities of color and law enforcement, because far too often a young person's introduction to the police is based on a negative interaction that often starts with a traffic violation. And then on top of that, we're still not solving crimes. We're still not arresting the folks who are terrorizing neighborhoods. For us in the city of Philadelphia, our homicide arrest rate is below 30%, which means that if you commit a murder right now in the city of Philadelphia, you're more likely to have some level of retaliation based on the people who are trying to find you than you are to be arrested by the police department. So at the end of the day, this isn't about beating up the police department. This is about working together to become more effective, more efficient, and hopefully prevent unfortunate situations like what we've seen far too often across the country from happening, where innocent, often people of color, are paying the ultimate price for a $51 fine.
Thank you, Council Member. And there are a lot of similarities between the data in Philly and in Chicago, especially the less than 2% of stops are for speeding or DUI or reckless driving. And that efficiency point is really, I think, important here.
It can't be a coincidence though, right? Like, we can't say it's a coincidence that 2 major cities in 2 entirely different parts of the country with totally different tax structures and funding formulas for schools and all the stuff that we know are problems still have almost exact same data as it relates to motor vehicle code violations and the impact that they have, not just on public safety, but communities of color. So thank you.
Yes, definitely. The one size fit all solution we need to think about. I want to turn to Katie, who sort of, I think I saw you nodding your head, and I think some of this resonates with you. I know you all are trying to get some of these recommendations passed. What have been some of the challenges that you faced in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to echo off of what Councilmember Thompson or Thomas, maybe I'm saying it wrong, sorry, was saying in regards to working with the police. I think that in Brooklyn Center, everybody reacted from a tragedy of my son's death. And everybody was in a position where we didn't know what to do, but everybody knew that something needed to be done. And then we had a mayor that was, you know, had a big heart, wanted to make sure that we didn't see people of color in our city being killed by police, take a huge step in implementing this and creating a resolution that he wanted to implement. We had city council members that were all, you know, for it, passed it almost unanimously. And then now we had a shift in council. We have new 2 council members, which is really hard to get their buy-in with our resolution. So we have a lot of setbacks in that. I think one thing too is that when we started this, it was community members really thought that it was us against the police because of what happened to my son. That we were, you know, because I'm the chair of the traffic stops, that I was this person that hated police and I didn't think we needed police and I wanted to abolish police. Trying to get that message out to community to be able to tell them why we need community public reimagining our public safety. We still need police. I've never once said that, nor has anybody on our committee say that. We all know that we need police. We need them to be able to protect us. We need them to be able to stop crime in our city. Traffic stops is not one of them. So thinking back when we first started, that was one of our biggest challenges, is because of the fact that community thought we were not working with police. And honestly, in Brooklyn Center right now, it's hard because police officers are so hesitant to work with us. So we are, you know, reaching out to them, wanting them to come to our meetings and wanting to communicate with them. And we have a city liaison, which is somebody who's going back and forth between our committee and the police department to get their ideas and their recommendations and to work. We need to work directly. We have been saying that. Unfortunately, we have not been able to sit in the same space, share the same space with the police department. So that is one of our biggest challenges in Brooklyn Center is being able to create that space where our committee members are working and sitting in the same room at the same table with whether it's the chief of police, commanders, whoever. I mean, I'm at the point where I'm like, hey, I'm going to go to the police department and I'm going to sit there and organize, a meeting. Another challenge too in Brooklyn Center, like I said, was the shift of council. We had council buy-in at the beginning. Now we have 2 new council members that are not really feeling it. They think that policing in America does need to be changed, but not in Brooklyn Center. Even with statistics, with data, with, people being killed during traffic stops. And then trying to convince them that not only does this keep our community safe, it keeps our police officers safe as well. And trying to get that message out to them is challenging. We have done several community events, listening sessions, and that's really helped us with getting, bringing, I don't hate the word stakeholders, but we'll use it today, bringing stakeholders into to those conversations, right? So they can be a part of it. People who, have businesses in Brooklyn Center who feel that if we take away the traffic stop, policies, or if we change the traffic stop policies, that it's going to prevent somebody from doing a crime and driving away, that police officers are not going to be able to pull them over. So it's educating people who are listening, but they're not listening. They're not getting it. Also making sure that another challenge, unfortunately we've had so many. I think my personal challenge of being an impacted family, I have to, it's very personal for me. So I have to take that personal piece out of it. And a lot of people that are on our committee, it's personal, whether they have been pulled over before or treated unfairly by police officers, or they know a neighbor that has. So I think that our challenge also as the committee in Brooklyn Center is being able to take that personal piece away from it and focusing on making true change and not reacting emotionally, but reacting strategically. And just making sure, like the council member said, really, I wish we would have started at the beginning with working with the police officers. We were set up as an organization or as a committee during high alert, during high, because of the killing of my son. So immediately everybody, like you said, just wants to make change, and you're going to do it, and you want it immediately. And I think that being patient is one of them, and we've all had to learn patience through the last 2 years of working on this committee. And also just making sure that you're able to reach out and have those listening sessions. We weren't having them at first. We actually didn't have a whole lot prior to making our recommendations to City Council. City Council came back with us and they wanted us to communicate with the community more. And we did have somebody that was actually doing that, and it wasn't our committee members that were making those, building those rapports with communities. So that was a little step back to us because it wasn't we weren't out there. They weren't looking at our faces. We weren't able to have those conversations. We had a liaison or a buffer, if you want to say, a person that was doing it to tell them about the work that we were doing when in fact we should have been doing that. So I think that as a committee, we should have taken more more control of what we were able to do as a committee versus allowing people to come in and do that themselves. We should have took ownership in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. I'd like to turn to you, Max, to talk about some of the challenges in San Francisco.
Sure. So, I mean, not necessarily, well, I guess I'll say two things. The first thing is it's not necessarily a challenge, but it's just kind of where we are. So our policy is in this kind of interstitial place where the commission has voted on it and approved it, but it's not yet effective. And the reason it's not yet effective is because the way our system of government works is after a policy gets passed, the police union has an opportunity to negotiate with the city about whether the policy affects collectively bargained for rights. And the idea is that the union has a collective bargaining agreement with the city that covers wages and working conditions. And of course, the police commission doesn't have authority to come in and alter that contract. Now, that policy is a good policy. It's a totally legitimate process. The potential problem is that there is a history of abuse of this negotiation process to delay policies indefinitely, sometimes for years, and also abuse in terms of not confining the negotiations to potential working condition issues, but just reopening the whole policy, which is particularly problematic because these negotiations are outside of the view of the public. And the whole policymaking process is public, and then the union kind of getting a chance behind closed doors to amend the policy. Since that time, both the police department and the commission, I think, have made important efforts and reforms to make the process more timely and more focused on what it's designed to do, which is protect collectively bargained for rights. And so I'm hopeful that the policy will be productive, accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish without imposing undue delay. The second thing I'll just note as a challenge is that every policymaker, I don't care what your political leanings are, every policymaker loves to say that we need evidence-based, data-driven solutions. And I think there was a lot of kind of pressure put on the proponents of this policy, and rightfully so, I think, to show that the data supported what we wanted to do. And I think we met or exceeded that burden. We have very high quality data in California. The problem is the other side, the folks championing us to maintain the status quo, really had no data or evidence to support their arguments. And so I think misinformation and disinformation was a huge challenge. The police commission doesn't have a PR budget. And so, responding to the constant stream of just falsehoods and misrepresentations about what the policy would or would not do was an incredible challenge. I think by sticking with it and getting our message out there and getting the facts out there, we were able to shape the public debate over time. But that's something that was challenging to in our budget to actually kind of do that type of outreach.
Thank you. I could see how that could be really challenging. Bradley, so we know that Virginia has experienced attempts to roll back the legislation. Could you talk about those attempts or any other challenges that you all faced since the passage or with the process of passing?
Sure. So just a little bit of context. In Virginia, it's no exaggeration to say that until 3.5 years ago, we had never had a criminal justice reform movement. One of those states that even when there had been Democrats in power, they were very tough on crime. And part of the reason for this is, I mentioned the legislative process here, but also one of the challenges for criminal justice reformers is that elected prosecutors in Virginia actually are allowed to take 2 weeks of paid time to lobby the legislature. And there's no similar privilege given to public defenders or anyone who's interested in reforming things. So as a result, this group called the Virginia Association of Commonwealth's Attorneys pretty much had their way in Richmond for decades. And we don't have like a singular state police agency that gets really involved. Most of our police departments are local, and the sheriffs are also local constitutional offices. But it was this group, VACA, that sort of had the run of the show in Richmond. And this oddly kind of has worked to our benefit because they just weren't used to being challenged. They're the type of group that will just show up and have a couple bad anecdotes. And honestly, a lot of the times those anecdotes just aren't true. That happened we just call them out this session. They would mention cases that happened and they were just totally wrong with the facts or the dates they happened, things like that. And they kind of still haven't pivoted. So when they first attempted to repeal the pretextual policing limits, I'm not kidding about this. The bill patron began his hearing testimony by listing names of serial killers. And then he said that it was really important to have pretextual stops because that's the only way that police ever catch serial killers. If you don't believe me, you can go watch it. It's still on video. It was unbelievable. And of course, that list of names was easily countered when it was my chance to speak. And my condolences also to Ms. Wright. But we listed the names of the Black Americans who'd been killed after traffic stops, and just basically said to the legislature, that's the list that matters a lot more to us. That's the truth, and that's the injustice we're trying to prevent. So they didn't have much success that first time where they tried to repeal, just because their arguments were so silly. There also was a deputy attorney general who came to testify, and she talked about, she just gave these really bombastic descriptions of traffic accidents that she was aware of happening. And she didn't have any data to show they were connected to any of the traffic infractions that we had made secondary stops. It was just all sort of fact-free fear mongering. It didn't work. However, one thing that did work, and this is really something that, criminal justice reform is bipartisan. It's bipartisan in both directions. It's you get some conservatives who support it, and you get some Democrats a lot of Democrats who oppose it. And a Democratic-led legislature partially repealed our legislation. They put back the loud exhaust statute. They made that a primary offense again. And the reason they did that, and I talked to a lot of them, is because, quite honestly, it was wealthy white constituents who were writing constituent letters, who were saying, we're hearing cars driving too fast on Route 50, and the exhaust noise bothers us. By the way, this was at the beginning of 2022. So really, the pandemic was just starting to ease up. Everybody was at home. Everybody was just hearing cars driving. I lived in one of these corridors. I lived in one of these corridors where supposedly the exhaust notes had risen and gotten more loud. Never noticed a change at all. I think it was just people being, self-centered and looking for something to complain about, as often happens with state government. So they did put that one back in, but then they tried again for a full repeal this last session, which ended in March. And what we were worried about arguments about, first of all, gun violence, and second of all, traffic safety. And they somehow didn't really bring much of an argument with respect to traffic safety, even though traffic fatalities have risen, I think, nationwide. Maybe that was the reason they didn't bring that argument, because the data wasn't exceptional. It was the same in Virginia as many places. And we still we have better data collection in Virginia now. It's still nowhere near like what California does, or probably any of the cities that you all live in, but at least we know about general racial disparities, and it is pretty shocking. In Virginia, Black drivers are about twice as likely to be pulled over as white drivers, and close to 3 times more likely to have their cars searched. And those racial disparities actually had narrowed a bit the first year that legislation was in place. But then they started expanding again as police started identifying new pretexts to use, and we knew that would happen. And that's why we also support what Max was talking about, and these other efforts to end consent searches. But anyway, the data really was sort of mixed, so they didn't rely on much on that. But gun violence was mentioned quite a bit, and I think for us, the key points on that were things that have already been mentioned. One is to highlight how inefficient traffic stops are for locating contraband. And I actually prefer to separate the 2 forms of contraband they're generally looking for, because they much more commonly find drugs. And why are we doing that? So this is a practice that started with the drug war. And actually Virginia was sort of ground zero for it. That's where this Operation Pipeline back in the late 70s, early 80s, it started up in the I-95 corridor, and it was all about getting drugs. So they find drugs like 1 in 180, 190 stops. They find a legal gun 1 in 900 stops. So if you're really looking to end gun violence, first of all, you have to make the connection between just having an illegal gun and that person's supposed to use it, which is supposedly going to use it, which to me is unclear in an illegal way. So that is not necessarily supported by data, but moreover, like, shouldn't we have better ways to address gun violence in this era? You know, we have community violence prevention and harm reduction models that have a great deal of success and are being implemented, and they work when they're adequately funded. And to me, that's the right response. If in this era where people are all concerned about gun violence, if this is such a ridiculous way to approach the problem of gun violence, to have hunch-based, dragnet, racist policing where you're just violating everybody's Fourth Amendment rights all the time in hopes of finding something you have no reason to believe is there. Like, in an era of data, shouldn't we be able to do better than that? And I think we should. And putting that onus on the police to actually do their jobs better, to me, was an effective response. But again, to be candid, they really haven't done a good job with the repeal advocacy yet. And I think part of it is just they're pivoting. They're, by the way, a lot of people are talking about collaboration in other states. Or in cities and states, that's not possible in Virginia. There is just no way to even have a reasonable conversation with people in Vaca. They're talking about this as an anti-serial killer measure. Think about it. Like, can you really have a rational conversation with that person about compromise? You really can't. So we just have to sort of go guns blazing and defend this stuff on principles that it's wrong, it's morally wrong, and that it's inefficient, and we can do better.
Thank you, Brad. And you started to go into some of the outcomes with the implementation and the racial disparities sort of climbing back up after the legislation was passed. It's been 2 years. I want to open this up to both you and Councilmember Thomas, who's also touched on a couple of the outcomes. Is there anything notable around traffic safety, public safety, the data, the community response that you all have received after implementation that you haven't touched on yet?
Just quickly, it'll be quick for me. Like, I think that the data. So data collection is really difficult unless you have funding, and there's just no funding for any criminal justice reform stuff in Virginia. Like, we've been a volunteer-led organization for years. We've gotten this much done basically working in our free time. But if we are doing this in our free time, we obviously don't have any extra money to spend on collecting police data and analyzing traffic, accident data. But my assumption would be that it would be the same as like they found in Fayetteville after they got rid of pretextual stops. They emphasized traffic enforcement of actual dangerous driving behavior, and they found that traffic safety did not get worse, or traffic fatalities did not increase, and nor did gun violence. Or actually, I think traffic fatalities decreased and gun violence did not increase. Violent crime didn't increase. So yeah, it's something we need. I guess the point that I would make is we need more data collection, more data analysis to support the efficacy of these reforms.
Yeah, I mean, from the work that we've done in Philadelphia, I think some interesting data is still coming. But one thing I haven't shared yet is prior to the implementation of driving equality, we've seen over 200,000 traffic stops. 217,963, and 318 times out of those 200,000 plus traffic stops were a firearm or some type of contraband recovered. Since driving equality has been implemented, that number has gone up to 346 times where we've discovered some type of contraband or a weapon during a traffic stop, with only 64,000 traffic stops, which is a small percentage compared to the 217,000 traffic stops it took to get 300 incidents of a weapon in or contraband. And we would like to believe that we see much more efficiency as it relates to these numbers, because people are being pulled over and the focus is leaning more towards things that are actually a public safety hazard, instead of just trying to randomly pull people over. While we would want to see more traffic stops for things like speeding and running a stop sign and things that are significant, we know that those numbers are still low. Just the fact that we've seen a higher percentage, it shows that the legislation is forcing us to be a little more efficient as it relates to government. We talked earlier that since driving equality was implemented, traffic stops have dropped 54% in the city of Philadelphia. 11,879 fewer Black drivers were stopped since the implementation of the bill. Traffic stops for driving equality related incidents. Traffic stops for 9 driving equality related incidents have actually increased by 19%, while traffic stops for driving equality incidents have, of course, decreased significantly. So at the end of the day, the data is important. It tells us that the legislation and what we're doing is working, but it also tells us that we still have more work to do because we do know that there are still a number of disproportionate level of stops based on certain incidents. The one thing that we've tried to stay away from, and I heard us talking a little bit about noise ordinances earlier. For us, we have similar issues as it relates to noise ordinance and modified vehicles and ATVs and things of that capacity. So we're looking at using technology to implement a system where we can provide tickets to people automatically without forcing a motor vehicle code stop. So we're trying to brainstorm from a legislative perspective what can be done about that. And then we're looking at other means of being able to enforce motor vehicle code violations without a traffic stop, like automatic scan systems. It becomes tricky because you don't want to over ticket poor people and create an issue where people who are living in poverty we're taxing them on another level because of the number of citations they may see in a week based on an expired registration or emission or inspection sticker. So it's very important that when we think through some of these solutions that we get it right, because what we don't want to see is unintended consequences that ends up hurting the same group of people that we're trying to protect when we're introducing legislation such as driving equality and some of the other initiatives that are taking place in different areas all across the country. So those are a few talking points and data based on the work that we've done in the city of Philadelphia. And I just want to just thank everybody for the work that they're doing across the country. When you operate in a legislative body, you're of course always working with other people. But anytime I can convene a group like this, where you have like-minded people across the country who are fighting a similar fight and dealing with similar issues, it's inspiring to continue to do the work that we're all doing, because you know that you're not by yourself. You know that there are people all across the country who's advocating and fighting for the same things you are. So I just wanted to also thank everybody, because this has been truly inspiring, and it's the cup of tea that I know I've needed to keep me doing the good work in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Councilmember Thomas. And that sort of leads into my final question for the whole group, and then we can transition into some Q&A. We're all in this space learning from each other. We've all shared a lot of information about the different plights that these your respective jurisdictions have gone through to really reform traffic stops. Is there any additional advice that you would give to some of the government actors, advocates, community organizers who are interested in changing the practice of traffic stops in their communities that are on this call and that will see this in the future? And we can start with Katie.
I do want to say, so changing policies into ordinances, and I know that it is bigger than city jurisdictions, right? It's at state level because we're dealing with legislation. But one thing we did in Brooklyn Center is recommended an ordinance versus a policy, because like you said, chiefs can change policies. So that's one thing that I would recommend if other communities were doing that. That's one thing that we have done. Also, just in the beginning, community is big. We want to make sure that we have community input. That's where we lacked at first, and now we have community. We have overwhelming support from community, but unfortunately, sometimes the loudest voices are the ones that are against you. So that was a challenge. But I just think that working and continuing to work you're going to have setbacks. You're going to have crying sessions, unfortunately, and you just got to keep pushing and keep fighting, because it's going to keep your neighbors safe. It's going to keep your and I always tell everybody, you may not have a Black child, you may not have a person of color in your family, but I can guarantee there's a person of color that has affected your life in some way that you could be protecting if you continue to fight and say what you mean. I think that in the beginning, I kind of allowed my voice to not be heard because I was worried that I was going to say the wrong thing, or maybe but no, I'm not going to be quiet anymore. And I think that all of you that are fighting for these changes really gives me the inspiration. So I wanted to thank you guys as well. But just making sure that, you know, you continue to push forward even through the setbacks, even though it's going to be challenging. And also just working with, I know that somebody said that, you know, regardless of what the data says, we know that it's happening, but unfortunately you do have people that need that data in order to make their decision on whether they're going to have that buy-in, right? So I think just pulling as much data as you can, having the data to back your and support what you're trying to change is a big thing. Me, I don't need to see data. I see my son every day in an urn, so I don't need that data. But there's going to be that 70-year-old white woman that is not going to support this because, you know, that's not her thing. She's either a racist or she, you know, everything in her life has been going just fine. She doesn't have to worry about driving in a certain neighborhood after 6:00 p.m. That's when the data, whether you can change it or not, that's when that data really helps. So that's just kind of my my take on it, and just advice that I could give that we're doing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And I'll turn to Max for advice for the folks on the call.
Yeah, I would definitely echo Katie's comment about the need for community input. I think having robust community input can only increase the legitimacy of whatever the ultimate policy decision is. I think I'll say something that might be controversial, especially in this group, which is I think one thing I wish I had done differently is to talk less about race at the outset. I think that there is a reflexive instinct from a lot of people that any type of police reform that's geared towards racial equity, that there's kind of an inherent trade-off between that and public safety. And, you know, I know the folks on this call and the folks who do this work know that that's not true, but that I think created a lot of headwinds for us, and we had to do a lot of explaining. And I think focusing the messaging more on, actually, this is all about public safety. If you're a small business owner, wouldn't you rather have more police foot patrols in your commercial corridor instead of making stops that aren't making anyone safer, and focus on the public safety opportunity cost of these stops? You know, we could have more foot patrols, more community policing. We could increase our clearance rate for violent crime. And I think having that be the first bullet point of the messaging, I think would have allowed us to have a broader coalition at the outset. Instead of having to kind of respond to the reflexive feedback. Well, wait a minute, isn't this gonna, you know, our crime rate's gonna spike now if we do this? So that's kind of, if I could go back to the beginning, that's one thing that I might have done differently.
Okay, thank you. Brad?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and disagree with that. I actually think that the greatest challenge of criminal justice reform in general is it's issue framing and messaging as a means of educating lawmakers and the public. Like I started out talking today, I talked about how, you know, carceral actors sort of rush forward to seize the narrative and narrow the issue to as you know, reforms that would change as little as possible to make it seem like they care about these issues, and are doing something, when in fact, what they're trying to do is just maintain as much power as possible. And as a result, like the media buys into that, the public buys into that. So we start thinking about things like, implicit bias training or, ending chokeholds, and all those things are all fine and good, but they don't address the heart of the problem here. And I think the heart of the problem, quite frankly, is a problem of race. And, the way to message this is by telling stories of the people who have been affected by this system. Miss Wright's story and her son's story, in Virginia. There was a Black Army lieutenant, Karen Nazario, whose assault by police was caught on video. That the verdict in his lawsuit actually happened right around the time the legislative session was taking place, as did the murder of Tyree Nichols. And I can tell you what, those Senate Judiciary hearings we were in, Senator Louise Lucas, who's herself a Black woman, senator in Virginia, basically shut down all debate and just said, we aren't doing this. We aren't repealing these limits on pretextual policing the same week that Tyree Nichols was murdered, and basically just shut them up. And I think even almost as important, although those I think are the most powerful stories, and those are the voices that need to be amplified, because those really move the needle. If you're relying on people just to follow their own self-interest in this, you're just going to get more police and you're going to get more prisons. Ultimately, you're not going to win that debate, I don't think. But the other way we challenge these practices is by doing a better job just with our own messaging and using plain language. The fact that we have a conversation, we're having a conversation about traffic enforcement, good. But really, like I said before, where this comes back to, it comes back to the fact that in 1996, you had actually all 9 justices of the Supreme Court who said that the subjective motivations of a police officer are irrelevant to the Fourth Amendment analysis, totally irrelevant. So what they've confirmed this over and over since then, in case after case. It is absolutely the case that a police officer can be thinking in his head, I do not like Black people. I'm pulling over this Black person because they're Black. And as long as they can identify a traffic infraction that person committed, and even if you find out all those facts about that officer, maybe that officer was in like a racist group, like I don't even know, like Tribe Boys or something, and maybe that officer had even disclosed, like, oh yeah, I really, like I saw the color of the other drivers, and like but they definitely took they had their rear brake light out or something. It doesn't matter. You still have no redress under the Fourth Amendment, and you barely have any redress under the 14th Amendment, the equal protection. You can't, because you can't even sue without basically direct evidence of racial animus. So we've got a constitution that allows this, and as long as Black people are allowed to be pulled over because they're Black, like, this is going to keep happening. So we need to talk about it in those terms. People need to understand that's why this is so egregious. And I think when we message effectively in that way, then you change minds, you change hearts, and people feel motivated to actually do something about it.
Thank you, Brad. And with that, we'll get our last answer here from Councilmember Thomas about any advice that you have for folks listening to this webinar.
Yeah, it was a question that I was trying to answer. My advice to legislators is different than to advocacy folks, because advocacy is, you have to fight and continue to fight until you get the justice or the change that you need to see. But when you're a legislator, your job is to compromise. That is a natural part of what it means to be a politician. I don't care what type of politician you are. We all have to compromise at some point to be able to deliver resources and bring home the bacon. So, for me, at the end of the day, my biggest advice would be to any legislator, to the advocates, just fight, keep doing the good work. I mean, if you're here right now, hopefully you've been inspired to continue that advocacy. But to legislators, I would just say, make sure you have thick skin. A lot of times the level of scrutiny that we receive when you're doing things in the name of race, and I understand exactly why Max said to not put race in it. I completely understand where Max is coming from. I understand why Brad disagrees with that as well too. So I see both dynamics for sure. But if you are going to move the way that Brad suggested, and you're going to speak truth to power around race-related issues with traffic stops, as a legislator, you better be prepared to have thick skin. You know, we get trolled from people all across the country, people who aren't even Philadelphia residents, people who never even stepped foot in our city. And at the end of the day, when you do things that are in the name of disadvantaged people, poor people, Black people, people of color, you know, people are going to criticize you heavily, because we have to be honest about the fact that a large part of our society thrives on the failure of Black and brown people. A large part of our society need Black and brown people to be poor, to have traumatic experiences, to continue to be oppressed. And anytime you're talking about liberating the most oppressed groups of people in this country in any way, shape, or form, there's going to be some level of resistance. There's going to be some level of pushback. And most importantly, people are always going to try to distort the message and create this perception that you're doing things that's reckless or lawless, or, you know, other dog whistle terms that have been used since long before I've been born, to continue to perpetuate narratives that just aren't true when you're fighting for our most disadvantaged people. So at the end of the day, it sounds great to sit here on a panel and share these thoughts, and to have this moment with like-minded people across the country. But these opportunities are few and far between. Very rarely do I get to spend an afternoon talking to amazing people about great work that's happening across the country. Unfortunately, we're spending a lot of time in court, in negotiation, oversight of the legislation, analyzing the data, and making sure that it's done in a way that's not just right, but that we're also controlling the narrative. So at the end of the day, thick skin is very important. And one last thing I'll add is that including the public in dialogue is very important. Prior to the bill being passed into law, we partnered with some of our bigger radio stations in the city of Philadelphia to have town halls. We did them in person, we did them online. We had a number of robust conversations so people understood exactly what we were going to do with the bill, because we also knew that there were going to be folks who were going to try to spin a narrative. And that's still taking place right now, but we're happy that we had a number of different conversations prior to the bill even being passed in the law. We were able to answer questions from constituents all across the city of Philadelphia. For us in Philadelphia, we have a driving equality website. I did put it in the chat feature, but the website is drivingequality.my.canva.site. I'm also very active on social media as well. If you just look up Isaiah Thomas, Philadelphia City Council, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And I've talked to over a dozen cities all across the country about replicating driving equality in their particular area. So myself and my team, we try to make ourselves readily available. We've most recently worked with elected officials in Memphis to try to help them think through some legislative solutions to some of the issues that they're facing. So again, thank you for having me. Thank you to this amazing panel. And I'm truly inspired by the work you all did.
Thank you, Council Member. I'm going to pass it to Amy Thompson to quickly wrap up. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you so much again to our moderator, Lauren, and to the panelists for this engaging conversation. The work each of you has done in your respective jurisdictions is inspiring and motivating. You're each paving the way for communities like Chicago to make serious and necessary changes in their approach to traffic safety. If you're interested in learning more or continuing the conversation, there are a couple action steps you can take today. To learn more about the issues with traffic stops here in Chicago, please read our report, A New Vehicle for Stop and Frisk, the Scope, Impact, and Inequities of Traffic Stops in Chicago at freetomoveshy.org. It'll be linked in the chat. At that page, you'll also be able to view a recording of this panel in the coming days. You can also sign up at that website to join or receive updates from the Free to Move Coalition, also linked in the chat. Thank you again to our panelists and to the attendees for joining us today for this insightful discussion. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.